Once upon a time in the late 1900s to early 2000s, superhero movies and shows were nowhere near the biggest IPs on the planet. Comedies and animated Disney films ruled the box office, and comic book movies were actually pretty niche. There were definitely some big successes, but there were far more failures. A lot of movies from this era end up on a lot of people's worst movies of all time list. But while comic book movies like Catwoman and Ghost Rider seem to fall in that bad but enjoyable category, Daredevil seems to get a much more volatile response. The movie didn't really stick with me over the years like Blade or Spider-Man, but I don't remember it being offensively terrible. On a $75 million budget, the movie had a respectable $40 million opening, and it finished its run making about $179 million overall. So even though it didn't amass more than movies like Spider-Man, it did make a profit and seemed to gain a decent fan base. So why is it so hated within the comic book movie community? What's going on, y'all? It's your boy Eddie, man. Welcome back to NerdyB4itWasCool, where we nerd out about TV and film. This is a segment we haven't done in a while, and it's episode 4 of Is It Really That Bad? Where we go back and take a look at films that were destroyed by critics and try to determine that very question. The defendant of today's episode is 2003 Daredevil starring Ben Affleck. Let's get right into it with the good stuff. For whatever reason, I thought this film was a lot more intentionally campy than it actually is, but they actually handled the tone far more serious than I remembered. This movie was written by Mark Steven Johnson. He's written a lot of rom-coms like 2020's Love in the Villa, 2010's When in Rome, 2020's Love Guaranteed, and a few movies in that vein. But he also obviously wrote this Daredevil film, the Elektra spinoff, and the 2 Ghost Rider movies as well. So taking a look at his filmography, it makes sense why one of the stronger elements of this movie is the romantic relationship between Daredevil and Elektra. Now, me personally, I could care less about relationships in my superhero shows, especially when they don't really have anything to do with the plot and they're just used as melodrama or side stories. But I really like how they tie the Elektra storyline with the main storyline in Daredevil. Her being a lot more involved in the scene and a lot more powerful than she led on with Matt's character at first, and her father having very strong ties to Kingpin ended up leading to one of the best parts of the movie, which is when Bullseye actually frames Daredevil for killing Elektra's dad and killing their instant connection and romance, and pretty much sends Elektra after Daredevil. That chunk of the movie was actually one of my favorite parts, and I wish they kept that tension going just a little bit longer. I think they relieved that aspect of Elektra not knowing that Matt was Daredevil off a little bit too early. And speaking of relationships, I also really like the Bunky Matt Murdock relationship. It just feels so natural. It's totally believable that these two have been friends for a very long time. Editing Eddie here, I just realized I kept referring to Foggy's character as Bunky, and I have no idea why. I messed up, but just go along with it, okay? Matt Murdock in this film is a little bit pretentious. He's kind of self-righteous and kind of sees himself as morally above everyone else. Bunky does a really good job at keeping him grounded and helping him see the world through a different lens. The moral high ground that Matt Murdock takes in this movie is kind of a part of his arc throughout the film. Vengeance versus justice. Not a fully original concept. We've seen it a lot with vigilante type of movies and shows, but it was executed pretty well in my opinion. He had a really good arc. The first chunk of this movie is pretty typical origin story fare, but I thought it did a really good job at setting up the tone of the story, because once again, I thought this was going to be really cheesy and campy, and it definitely still is cheesy, but not from intentional camp. I like the backstory into Daredevil's dad of him being a boxer who was pretty much paid to throw fights. Later on, the movie kind of veers off into some ridiculousness, so this first chunk was a nice grounded bit of the movie. And if anything, this movie further drove home the point: if you're gonna be a superhero, you gotta have a messed up childhood. You gotta have some messed up parents. That's the only way it can work. This movie gets a lot of flack for its writing, and I understand why. It's pretty thin across the board, but there were some good connective tissues throughout this movie. Little hints dropped, some callbacks of things characters said to each other in earlier parts of the movie, then coming in later and tying into the theme. I thought a lot of that was actually done very well. The casting in this movie was fine, and I guess the best part of that casting is now having that added on layer of nostalgia. Seeing little bits and pieces of why Zack Snyder may have chosen Ben Affleck to be Batman in the future. And also seeing Colin Ferrel as Bullseye in here, and now looking at his career trajectory and seeing him being pretty much one of the best character actors in Hollywood. We got Happy Hogan from the MCU as Bunky. I enjoyed the watching of this movie a lot more than I thought I would, and nostalgia definitely played a big role in that. And on top of that, I like how about that action that Daredevil was. He has a pretty dark brand of justice, and he wasn't afraid to kill people, which was tied into his arc as a character. The fight scenes were extremely well done. I surprisingly really enjoyed the cinematography. I thought it was very well lit, and for 04, I thought they did a pretty good job at blending CGI and practical effects. Getting back to Daredevil's arc for a little bit, I really enjoyed it. Like I said, he had no problem killing people in this movie. I definitely did not remember him being that brutal. And with that ending fight scene between him and Kingpin, I thought it was an extremely powerful move for him not to kill Kingpin and make him go through real justice to try to see if something can be done for the actual justice system instead of killing him like he's done pretty effortlessly throughout this entire movie. And once again, the writing throughout this thing definitely can be thin, and we will for sure get into that when we get to the bad stuff, but the movie had a pretty good foundation, and I'll go out on the limb and say I think this film was a couple of edits away from being a much better movie.
Let's get this over with.
Okay, so where do I start? Let's circle back to the tone. This movie tried so hard to be serious, and I commend it for that. I commend it for taking the source material seriously. This movie wasn't above the comic booky elements like a lot of superhero movies around that time were. It didn't look down on the genre. It didn't try to give off this "we're too cool for comic book media" vibe. It really tried, like they really tried to give us a serious movie. But with this uber serious tone that they try to provide and all these edgy pop emo records over these montage after montage after montage. This came out so edgy, and I mean that in the worst way. And it's no better way to reiterate that by the character introductions. Let's look at Bullseye. The first time we meet this guy, he's in a random pub. He's just playing darts and taking people's money. Then he just kills this guy right in front of everyone and does this weird twitchy look. Like, we can tell that was supposed to be a ooh ah moment. The people in the background even stopped talking as if they were wanting people in the theater to kind of gasp. I feel like a better character introduction for Bullseye would have been when we see him on the plane and the old lady is just yapping and yapping and she won't stop talking, and then he flicks that peanut down her throat.
Pause.
And just silently and hilariously kills this old lady. Like, just imagine if that was the first time we saw Bullseye. That's what I mean by I feel like this movie was just a couple of edits away from being really good. Continuing with the cringy intros, although it started off pretty cool and wholesome, that dumbass Daredevil vs. Elektra fight in the playground in front of all those kids was so stupid. It's like, hey, I'm just trying to get to know you, so let me put these hands and feet on you real quick. That violent ass introduction made no sense compared to how wholesome the rest of their relationship played out. But with that being said, I feel like if there was more of this, whether intentional or unintentional, I feel like it would have made it a little bit much more of an enjoyable rewatch. With all that being said, I still think the first half of this movie is pretty solid. But once you get to the halfway point, this movie becomes so cookie cutter and predictable, man. I really love that they incorporated Elektra into the story, and that moment where Bullseye framed Daredevil. I thought all of that was really cool, but they let that tension go so quick, and after that you could pretty much guess what was gonna happen at every step of the way of this movie. They could have spent a little bit more time making Wilson Fisk a lot more compelling villain. Instead of doing that, they chose to do this almost video game style where Daredevil is kind kind of searching for who's behind everything. He goes from finding petty thugs to criminals and eventually getting to the big boss at the end of the movie. The way they were writing it made it seem like they wanted to keep everything a mystery, but much like a lot of other elements in this movie, they gave it up a little too quickly that Kingpin was gonna be behind everything, which is something if you have a little bit of knowledge of Daredevil, you know that's gonna happen anyway. So I feel like that attempt at a mystery element was just a pointless point in the story. But the biggest and most apparent flaw of this film is definitely gonna have to be the believability, or what Robert Meyer Burnett would say, there's absolutely no verisimilitude in this story whatsoever. Daredevil was splashed in his eyes by a radioactive chemical, and we know that's why he goes blind. We understand that's why he gets his powers and his other senses are heightened. But what about this radioactive chemical makes him be able to, I don't know, dive off of skyscrapers and land on his feet with taking no damage and not being hurt whatsoever? What about this radioactive chemical gives him a 350-inch vertical where he can literally jump from rooftop to rooftop, easily clearing a length of 200 to 250 feet. This man spent his time dressing up like Daredevil trying to scare criminals to save New York when he should have been trying out for the New York Knicks. I mean, this man has a 300-inch vertical. We've seen that he runs as fast as cars, so I mean at least 40 miles per hour. That's how you save New York City. He could have easily taken over the NBA. But on a more serious note, those things sound kind of like nitpicks, but that believability is just so important. So not only is there no verisimilitude with his character in this world they're trying to show us, but there's also no consistency with his power or durability. So we've seen him take all this damage, right? And then at the end when he fights Elektra, she stabs him in the shoulder and that takes him out for so long that he has to watch Elektra get killed by Bullseye when he could have easily gotten up and helped, because he easily got up, ran away, and then fought Bullseye just minutes later and beat him. And then just minutes after that, he went all the way to Fisk and beat him as well. It's so important that we really feel like this world could exist. Do I know a spider's not gonna bite someone and give them spider powers? Yes, I know that logically, but I still believe that this world could exist when I watch the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies.
I'm not the bad guy.
On a positive note, there were definitely a lot more positives that I took away than I thought I would. I really love Michael Clarke Duncan's Kingpin, and I wish we got to see just a little bit more of him throughout this film. I also like Daredevil's arc. I thought it was pretty well done for the most part. On the negative note, the uber serious tone that they tried to provide in this film ended up making a lot of chunks of this thing feel extremely, and I mean extremely, outdated. With the inconsistencies with his abilities and powers, it also gave this movie no verisimilitude, which is very important for superhero films. But the big question is Daredevil 2003 that bad? Do I agree with the critics? I'm gonna have to say I disagree with the critics, but I definitely don't think this is some slept on masterpiece. I'm gonna give Daredevil 2003 a 4.8 out of 10. Slightly under average for superhero movies of that time. Of that time is a very important part of that sentence. So yeah, that's how I'm feeling. 4.8 out of 10. Do you think I was a little too nice to Daredevil? Do you think this is some hidden gem or masterpiece of a film that gets too much hate? I would love to know what you think down in the comments.